maestoso.
Di quai la dolce sera, così sarà.
The old piano stood quietly near the large front window of the cafe. It had been there for years. Most people hardly noticed it anymore. Some customers thought it was only decoration. Others believed it no longer worked because no one had played it in a very long time. A small wooden sign beside it simply said, "Guests may ask the manager before playing." It was a cool Saturday afternoon, and the cafe was full of people. Friends were meeting after work. Families were enjoying lunch together. A few students sat with their laptops, trying to finish assignments before the weekend. Soft music played through the speakers, mixing with the sounds of cups, laughter, and quiet conversations. The staff moved quickly from table to table. Every seat was filled. Outside, people walked along the busy street without paying much attention to the cafe. Just before 3 o'clock, the front door opened. A young woman stepped inside. She wore clean but simple clothes. Her shoes showed signs of being worn for many months, and she carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. Nothing about her appearance made people turn their heads. She looked like someone stopping in for a warm drink after a long day. She paused near the entrance for a moment and looked around the room. Her eyes stopped on the old piano. For several seconds, she simply stood there. Then she slowly walked toward the counter. The manager was checking receipts while speaking with one of the waiters. He looked busy and slightly tired after serving customers since early morning. "Excuse me," the young woman said politely. The manager looked up. "Yes, I wanted to ask something." "Of course." She smiled gently. "Would it be all right if I played the piano for just a few minutes?" The manager blinked. He looked toward the piano and then back at her. "You play?" She nodded. "I do." He studied her face for a moment. "We usually don't let many people use it." "I understand," she replied. "If it isn't possible, that's completely fine." There was no pressure in her voice. She sounded calm. The manager glanced around the crowded cafe. He worried that someone might complain if the music became too loud. "Just one moment," he said. He walked over to the piano and lifted the cover from the keys. A thin layer of dust rested along the edges. He pressed one key. The note echoed softly through the room. Then another. The piano was still working. He looked back at the young woman. "You really only need a few minutes?" "Yes. I don't want anything loud." She smiled again. "I promise." The manager thought for another second before giving a small nod. "All right. Thank you." She quietly walked toward the piano. Only a few nearby customers noticed. One man whispered to his friend, "I didn't even know people could play that thing." His friend laughed. "Maybe she's just practicing." Another customer glanced over before returning to a conversation about work. No one expected anything special. The young woman reached the piano and gently placed her bag on the floor beside the bench. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she carefully brushed away a little dust from the wooden surface with her hand. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the piano. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. She seemed completely still, almost as if she was greeting an old friend. Then she quietly sat down. Across the room, a little girl noticed her. She tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, what is it?" "I think she's going to play." Her mother smiled without looking. "Maybe." The little girl turned toward the piano with curiosity. Nearby, two elderly friends paused their conversation. "I haven't heard that piano in years," one of them said. "Neither have I." At another table, 3 teenagers looked over for only a second. One shrugged. "This should be interesting." Another smiled. "Or maybe not." They laughed quietly. The young woman adjusted the bench slightly. She rolled her shoulders once. Then she placed both hands above the keys. She didn't begin. Instead, she looked around the room. Not because she wanted attention. She simply seemed thankful for the chance. The manager watched from behind the counter. He hoped she knew what she was doing. If customers complained, he would probably have to stop her. One waiter whispered, "Think she'll be good?" The other waiter smiled. "We'll find out." The cafe continued with its usual noise. Coffee machines hissed. Plates clinked. People laughed. Phones rang softly. The room remained busy. The young woman lowered her hands again without playing. She quietly reached into her bag. From inside, she removed a neatly folded cloth. She carefully wiped each key. White, black, white, black. She worked slowly, almost respectfully. One customer noticed. "She's cleaning it first." Another smiled. "That's actually kind of thoughtful." The manager watched with surprise. No one had cleaned the piano in months. When she finished, she folded the cloth and placed it back inside her bag. She rested both hands once more above the keyboard. Still, she waited. She took one slow breath. Outside the cafe window, people continued walking. Cars passed. Bicycles rolled by. Life moved normally. Inside, only a handful of people paid attention. The little girl continued watching. She leaned forward in her chair. "I hope she plays something pretty." Her mother smiled. "I'm sure she will." The young woman looked at the keys as though remembering something from long ago. A quiet memory crossed her face. Not sadness. Not happiness. Just deep thought. Far away in another part of the cafe, an older gentleman folded his newspaper. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward the piano. He had spent many years enjoying live music. Something about the way she sat caught his attention. Her posture was calm, relaxed, confident without trying to appear confident. He quietly thought to himself, "She looks comfortable." Most beginners looked nervous. She didn't. She simply looked ready. The manager noticed the same thing. His curiosity grew. Maybe she had played before. Maybe she had taken lessons years ago. Or maybe she simply enjoyed music as a hobby. No one knew. No one asked. The young woman finally pressed a single key. Just one. The note floated gently across the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was soft, almost delicate. Several people looked up. Not because of the note itself. Because it somehow sounded different. She played another. Then another. Still slowly. Testing the piano. Listening carefully. She smiled almost invisibly. The instrument was old. A few keys sounded slightly different from the others. But it still had life. She seemed happy about that. The elderly man folded his newspaper completely. Now he watched without distraction. The teenagers stopped talking for a moment. One of them said quietly, "She's taking her time." Another replied, "Maybe she's nervous." But she wasn't. She was simply getting to know the piano. Every instrument feels different. She wanted to understand this one before asking it to tell a story. The little girl rested her chin on both hands. "I like her already." Her mother finally looked toward the piano. "I think everyone is getting curious." The cafe remained mostly noisy, but something had changed. Without anyone realizing it, more eyes were turning toward the young woman. Not because she demanded attention, because she had done everything quietly. She hadn't walked in acting important. She hadn't announced herself. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She had simply asked one polite question. "May I play the piano?" That simple request was still echoing through the manager's mind. He remembered how respectfully she had spoken. Many people asked for favors with confidence. She had asked with kindness. If he had said no, she would have smiled and walked away. That thought made him unexpectedly glad he had agreed. The young woman adjusted her hands one final time. She took another slow breath. Now the room felt slightly different. People weren't completely silent, but conversations had become softer. Almost without noticing, several customers had stopped speaking. Even the waiters slowed down for a second. No announcement had been made. No spotlight had appeared. Nothing dramatic had happened. Yet somehow the cafe seemed to be waiting. The young woman gently looked at the keys. A peaceful smile appeared across her face. She whispered so quietly that only she could hear it. "Thank you." Then she lifted her fingers. The next moment was about to change an ordinary afternoon into something no one inside the cafe would ever forget. The room stayed quiet for just a heartbeat. Then her fingers touched the piano. The first melody floated gently through the cafe. It was soft, warm, and full of feeling. The notes did not rush. Each one seemed to have its own place, as if it had been waiting for years to be heard again. At first, only the people sitting closest to the piano noticed. The little girl smiled immediately. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Her mother slowly put down her coffee cup without taking her eyes off the young woman. "I wasn't expecting that," she said quietly. Near the counter, the manager looked up from the register. He had planned to return to work after the first few notes, but something made him stop. He folded his arms and listened. The waiters also slowed down. One of them whispered, "She really knows how to play." The other nodded without saying a word. The melody continued. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. There was something peaceful about it. The music seemed to settle over the room like a gentle breeze. Conversations became quieter without anyone asking for silence. A man who had been speaking on his phone lowered his voice. Another customer stopped typing on a laptop. Someone reached for a cup of coffee but forgot to take a sip. Outside the large window, people continued walking along the street. Inside the cafe, time seemed to slow down. The young woman remained completely focused. Her face was calm. She wasn't trying to perform for attention. She wasn't looking around to see who was watching. Her eyes stayed on the piano keys as though they were telling her where to go next. The old gentleman who had folded his newspaper leaned back in his chair. "I haven't heard someone play with this much feeling in years," he said softly. His friend nodded. "It reminds me of the days when music wasn't just background noise." Across the room, 3 teenagers looked at one another. One quietly slipped a phone back into a pocket. "I don't feel like scrolling anymore," the teenager admitted. The others laughed softly. "I know what you mean." One by one, people began paying attention. No one announced it. It simply happened. The sounds of forks and plates became less frequent. Even the coffee machine seemed quieter between orders. The manager noticed something unusual. No customers were complaining. Normally, whenever music changed in the cafe, someone would ask for it to be turned down or request something different. Today, no one said a word. Instead, more people looked toward the piano. The young woman moved naturally from one melody into another. The second piece sounded brighter, carried a gentle feeling of hope. Some customers smiled without realizing it. A couple sitting by the window looked at each other. "This reminds me of when we first met," the husband said. His wife smiled. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." Neither of them had expected an ordinary afternoon coffee to bring back such warm memories. Near the entrance, a delivery driver stepped inside with several boxes. He paused after hearing the music. Instead of leaving immediately, he quietly waited until a waiter noticed him. "Who's playing?" he asked. "I honestly don't know," the waiter replied. "She just asked if she could use the piano." The driver looked surprised. "Really?" The waiter nodded. "I thought she'd only play for a minute or two." The driver smiled. "I'm glad she did." Even customers who had arrived only moments earlier sensed that something special was happening. They entered speaking normally but quickly lowered their voices after hearing the piano. It felt almost natural. No signs asked people to stay quiet. The music itself seemed to ask politely. The little girl slowly climbed down from her chair. She looked at her mother. "Can I sit closer?" Her mother smiled. "As long as you don't disturb her." The little girl carefully walked toward an empty chair a few steps away from the piano. She sat quietly with both hands folded in her lap. The young woman never noticed. She remained completely lost in the music. Each note seemed connected to the next. There were no unnecessary movements. Her hands moved with quiet confidence. Not fast enough to impress. Not slow enough to seem careful. Simply natural. The elderly gentleman continued watching. "I've seen many people play difficult music," he quietly told his friend. "But not everyone can make people feel something." His friend nodded. "That's the difference." Several customers began smiling at complete strangers. One woman looked across the room and caught another customer's eye. Without saying anything, both smiled. It was as if the music had quietly connected everyone inside the cafe. Near the counter, One waiter forgot what table he was walking toward. He laughed at himself. I almost delivered this cake to the wrong customer. The manager chuckled. I think we're all a little distracted. The waiter smiled. I don't mind. The young woman finished one melody. For a brief second, silence filled the room. No one clapped. Not because they didn't enjoy it, because they didn't want to interrupt. She gently began another piece. This one carried more energy. The notes danced across the old piano. The instrument that had been ignored for years suddenly sounded alive again. The manager looked toward the dusty corner where the piano usually sat unnoticed. It almost feels like it's been waiting for today, he quietly said. One of the staff members smiled. I was thinking the same thing. Near the back of the cafe, a music teacher happened to be having lunch. Until now, the teacher had been reading through some papers. Slowly, the papers were placed on the table. Every bit of attention turned toward the performance. The teacher listened carefully, not just to the melody, but to the way she touched each key, the control, the balance, the emotion, the small details. The teacher quietly smiled. This isn't ordinary. Another customer overheard those words. What do you mean? The teacher answered honestly. Some people learn songs. The customer nodded. And she understands music. The customer looked back at the piano with fresh curiosity. No one knew anything about the young woman. No one knew where she had learned. No one knew whether she had performed before. Yet everyone seemed to have the same question. Who was she? The cafe door opened once again. Several new customers entered. One of them spoke loudly at first, then stopped. Why is everyone so quiet? Another customer whispered back. Listen. They did. Within seconds, they understood. Without asking another question, they found a table and quietly listened like everyone else. Outside, rain began falling lightly. Small drops tapped gently against the windows. The music mixed beautifully with the sound of the rain. The atmosphere inside became even warmer. People wrapped both hands around their coffee cups. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others simply closed their eyes. For a few minutes, nobody seemed to be in a hurry. The young woman continued playing. She never looked proud. She never acted like she wanted praise. She simply played from the heart. Every melody carried honesty. That honesty reached people more deeply than loud performances ever could. The little girl watched every movement. When the young woman crossed her hands over the keyboard during one passage, the girl's eyes became wide with amazement. I want to learn piano one day, she whispered to herself. Her mother heard her. She smiled warmly. I think that's a wonderful idea. At another table, two college students had been discussing exams. Their books remained open, but neither had turned a page for several minutes. I forgot what we were studying, one admitted. The other laughed quietly. I don't even care right now. Near the entrance, the delivery driver had still not left. He checked the time and smiled. I'll probably be late. Then he shrugged. Some moments are worth staying for. The manager walked toward the window and looked around the room. Every table was occupied. Nobody looked impatient. Nobody appeared bored. Instead, every face carried a peaceful expression. He had managed this cafe for many years. He had seen birthday parties, business meetings, family gatherings, and celebrations. But he had never seen complete strangers become so connected without speaking. The music had done what words could not. As another melody came to a gentle close, the room became perfectly still. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then, somewhere near the back of the cafe, one person softly began to clap. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire cafe filled with warm applause. The young woman looked up in surprise. She hadn't expected it. A quiet smile appeared on her face. She gave a small, thankful nod. The applause slowly faded. She thought the moment was over. She gently reached toward the piano lid, preparing to stand. But before she could close it, a voice came from the middle of the room. Please. Another customer smiled. Would you play one more? Then another voice followed. And after that, maybe one more. Soon gentle laughter spread through the cafe. For the first time that afternoon, the young woman looked around the room. Every face was turned toward her. Not because they expected entertainment, because they genuinely hoped she would continue. She smiled softly, took another quiet breath, placed both hands back on the keys, and prepared to play again. The young woman looked around the cafe for a few seconds. Every face was turned toward her. A few minutes earlier, most of these people had not even noticed she had walked in. Now they were waiting quietly, hoping she would continue. She smiled with a little surprise. "I can play one more," she said softly. The room answered with warm applause. She turned back to the piano and gently placed her hands on the keys once again. This time, the music felt different. The first pieces had been peaceful and welcoming. This melody carried something deeper. It sounded like a journey filled with hope, struggle, and quiet strength. No one spoke. Even the rain outside seemed softer. The little girl closed her eyes and listened carefully. She had never heard music make her imagine pictures before. In her mind, she saw long roads, open skies, and someone walking forward without giving up. The elderly gentleman leaned back in his chair. "There is a story behind this music," he whispered. His friend nodded. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." Near the counter, the manager quietly served another customer without taking his eyes off the piano for very long. "I've never seen the cafe like this," one waiter whispered. "It doesn't even feel like the same place." The manager smiled. Sometimes one person can change an entire room. As the melody continued, people began wondering about the young woman herself. Who had taught her? Where had she learned to play? Why had nobody heard of her before? The questions quietly spread from table to table. When the piece finally came to a gentle ending, the applause was even louder than before. The young woman stood slowly. "Thank you," she said with a grateful smile. She reached down to pick up her canvas bag. Just then, the manager walked over. "Would you mind staying for a few minutes?" he asked kindly. She looked a little unsure. "If I'm not causing trouble." He laughed softly. "Trouble? You've brought more peace into this cafe than I've seen in years." Several customers smiled after hearing those words. One of the elderly gentlemen spoke next. "If you have time, we'd love to know your story." The young woman looked around. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Normally, she preferred quiet places where no one noticed her. She gently shook her head. "My story isn't very interesting." The little girl smiled. "I think it is." The room filled with soft laughter. The young woman looked at the child and smiled back. The manager pointed toward an empty chair near the piano. "Please sit for a moment." She quietly agreed. Someone from the staff brought her a cup of tea. "I didn't order this," she said. "It's on the house," the manager replied. "You've given us something special today." She thanked him warmly. For a few moments, nobody rushed her. The customers simply waited. Finally, she spoke. "I started playing when I was very young." Everyone listened carefully. "My family didn't own a piano." Several people looked surprised. "Then how did you practice?" someone asked. She smiled. "Whenever I found one." The room became quiet again. There was an old community center not far from where I grew up. They had a piano that wasn't used very often. She paused for a second, remembering those days. "I would walk there after finishing my schoolwork." "Every day?" asked the music teacher from the back of the cafe. She nodded. "Almost every day." "What about lessons?" She smiled gently. "We couldn't afford them." The music teacher listened even more carefully. "So how did you learn?" "I watched." The answer surprised everyone. "I watched anyone who was willing to play." She continued. "Sometimes musicians practiced at the community center. I sat quietly in a corner and listened." She smiled as the memories returned. When they left, I tried to remember everything they had done. The little girl looked amazed. "You remembered all of it?" The young woman laughed softly. "Not at first." Everyone smiled. "I made many mistakes." The cafe felt even quieter now. The manager folded his arms and listened. "I played the same songs again and again." She looked down at her hands. My fingers became tired. But every mistake taught me something. The music teacher nodded with respect. That's a wonderful way to learn. She continued speaking. Sometimes I borrowed music books from the local library. You could read music? Slowly. I wasn't very fast. So I took the books home and studied every page. She smiled. Then I returned to the piano the next day. One customer asked, "Did anyone help you?" She thought for a moment. There was an older volunteer at the community center. She smiled warmly. He wasn't a music teacher. But every evening before locking the building, he let me practice for 1 extra hour. The manager smiled. That was kind. It changed everything. She looked toward the piano again. He always told me something. What was it? The little girl asked. He said, talent opens the first door. Hard work opens every door after that. The cafe became silent again. Several people quietly repeated those words in their minds. The music teacher smiled. Wise advice. The young woman nodded. I never forgot it. One customer asked another question. Did you ever think about giving up? She looked out the cafe window at the gentle rain. Many times. Nobody interrupted. There were days when life became difficult. She spoke honestly but calmly. I needed to help my family. So I worked. What kind of work? Someone asked. Whatever I could find. She smiled. I cleaned offices. I organized books. I helped at small shops. And whenever I had free time, she looked toward the piano. I practiced. The manager quietly looked at her worn shoes. He suddenly understood why they looked so old. Not because she didn't care. Because other things had always been more important. The little girl listened carefully. Were you ever angry? The young woman thought before answering. No. Sometimes I felt disappointed. But music always gave me hope. The elderly gentleman smiled. I can hear that hope when you play. She thanked him with a quiet nod. Another customer asked, Did you ever perform on big stages? She gently shook her head. No. Today's audience is actually one of the biggest I've ever played for. Everyone looked surprised. The waiter laughed. Really? She nodded. I usually play wherever I find a piano. The room became filled with quiet amazement. So today wasn't planned? Someone asked. No. I was walking past the cafe. I looked through the window. I saw the piano. And I simply hoped someone might let me play. The manager smiled. I'm very glad I said yes. So am I. Several customers answered at once. Everyone laughed. The atmosphere felt warm and friendly now. The young woman looked around the room. I didn't expect any of this. I only wanted to play for a few minutes. The music teacher stood and slowly walked closer. May I ask you something? Of course. When you play. She paused. What do you think about? The young woman looked down at the piano keys. I don't think about perfect notes. The teacher smiled. What do you think about then? She answered honestly. I think about people. The cafe remained completely still. I think about the people who encouraged me. The people who believed in me. The people who gave me small chances. She smiled gently. And I hope that anyone listening will leave feeling just a little lighter than before. The teacher's eyes filled with admiration. That's exactly why your music reaches people. Several customers nodded. Now they understood. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply sharing something meaningful. The little girl quietly walked closer. Can I ask one last question? The young woman smiled. You can. Will you keep playing? She looked at the child with kind eyes. As long as I can find a piano. She looked around the cafe. And someone willing to let me sit down. The little girl smiled from ear to ear. I hope lots of people let you. The room filled with gentle laughter once again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight slowly began shining through the large front windows. Golden light rested across the old piano. The manager noticed it first. It almost looks brand new. Everyone turned toward the piano. The dust that had covered it earlier was gone. The polished wood reflected the afternoon sunlight. For years, people had walked past that piano without giving it a second thought. Today, it had become the heart of the cafe. The young woman looked at the time and quietly stood. "I should probably go." Immediately several voices answered. "So soon? We were hoping you'd stay longer." She smiled warmly. "I have somewhere I need to be." The manager nodded with understanding. "At least let us thank you properly." She shook her head gently. "You already have." Before anyone could ask what she meant, she looked around the room filled with smiling faces. "When I walked in today, nobody knew me." She paused. "But now we've shared something together." She placed one hand lightly on the piano. "That's more valuable than I can explain." No one realized it yet, but among the people sitting quietly in that cafe was someone whose single decision before the day ended would completely change the direction of her life. The young woman picked up her canvas bag and thanked everyone once again. She truly believed the afternoon had come to an end. Her plan had been simple from the beginning. She only wanted to play the old piano for a few minutes before continuing with the rest of her day. She took 2 slow steps toward the cafe door. Then a calm voice spoke from one of the corner tables. "Excuse me." She turned around. An older woman stood up carefully. She had been sitting quietly near the window since before the performance began. She had listened without interrupting, speaking very little throughout the afternoon. The young woman smiled politely. "Yes. I hope you don't mind if I ask you one more favor." The young woman looked surprised. "What is it?" The older woman walked closer to the piano. "You've played beautiful music today." "Thank you. But I don't think you've shown us everything you can do." Several customers looked at one another. The young woman laughed softly. "I've already played more than I expected." "I know." The older woman smiled kindly. "But would you play one final piece?" The young woman looked around the room. Everyone seemed interested. She hesitated. "I don't want to keep everyone here." The manager smiled. "I don't think anyone is in a hurry." Several customers nodded. One of the waiters laughed. "I've never seen people stay this long after finishing their coffee." The room filled with quiet laughter. The young woman looked back at the older woman. "Is there a reason you asked?" "There is." The older woman paused for a moment. "I've loved piano music for many years." She gently rested one hand on the back of a chair. "My husband used to play." A peaceful smile appeared on her face. "He passed away several years ago." The room became very quiet. He believed music could remind people of the best parts of life. She looked toward the old piano. "When you played today," she smiled warmly. "For the first time in a long while, I felt that again." The young woman listened carefully. "I would be honored to play another piece." The older woman's eyes brightened. "Thank you." The young woman returned to the piano. This time she sat down more slowly. She didn't rush. She rested both hands on her lap for a few moments before looking at the keyboard. The cafe was completely silent. Even customers who had just entered sensed something important was about to happen. No one spoke. No phones rang. No chairs moved. The manager quietly lowered the music playing through the cafe speakers until it disappeared completely. Only the sound of gentle breathing remained. The young woman closed her eyes. She remembered the volunteer from the community center. She remembered practicing on cold evenings. She remembered borrowing music books from the library. She remembered walking long distances just to spend 1 hour at an old piano. Every memory seemed to settle peacefully inside her. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost like someone quietly telling a story. No one moved. The melody slowly grew richer. Each note seemed connected to a memory. The little girl leaned forward again. She had never seen someone's hands move with such calm confidence. The elderly gentleman quietly removed his glasses and smiled. "This one is different." His friend nodded. "It feels personal." The music teacher closed both eyes. Instead of studying technique, the teacher simply listened. Sometimes the greatest performances could not be measured by speed or difficulty. They were measured by feeling. This was one of those moments. The melody continued to grow. The old piano seemed to forget its age. Every key answered beautifully. It was almost impossible to believe this was the same instrument that had sat untouched for years. Near the counter, one waiter quietly whispered to another, "I've worked here 3 years. So have I. I never imagined this piano could sound like this." The manager smiled. Maybe it was waiting for the right person. Outside, people passing by noticed something unusual. Several looked through the large windows. They saw an entire cafe sitting quietly. Curious, some stepped inside. Instead of ordering immediately, they simply stood near the entrance and listened. The music welcomed them without words. Within minutes, every empty space near the back of the cafe had filled with people. Nobody wanted to interrupt. A young couple entering for the first time looked confused. "Is there a concert today?" the man whispered. The waiter smiled. "No." "Then who is she?" "We're still trying to figure that out." The couple quietly found a place to stand. They listened like everyone else. The melody changed once again. It became brighter, hopeful. The older woman who had requested the song smiled through quiet tears. She wasn't crying because she felt sad. She was remembering happy days. Days filled with music at home. Days when laughter and piano melodies drifted through open windows. She gently wiped her eyes. The young woman never noticed. She remained focused on the piano. She wasn't playing to impress. She wasn't performing for applause. She was simply sharing something honest. That honesty reached every corner of the room. The little girl quietly reached for her mother's hand. "This music feels like sunshine." Her mother smiled. "I think that's a beautiful way to describe it." Near the back of the cafe, the music teacher noticed another familiar face. A respected director from a local arts organization had quietly entered after hearing the music from outside. The teacher smiled with surprise. "I didn't know you were here," the director whispered back. "I wasn't. I heard the piano while walking past." The teacher nodded toward the young woman. "What do you think?" The director listened for another minute before answering. "I think we're hearing someone very special." Neither of them interrupted the performance. There would be time for conversations later. For now, the music deserved complete attention. The young woman moved naturally into another section of the piece. Her fingers danced lightly across the keys. Not to show off. Simply because the music asked them to. The room seemed to breathe together. Every face reflected a different memory. One customer remembered childhood. Another thought about family. Someone else remembered an old friend. The melody became different for every listener. That was its quiet gift. The manager looked around the cafe. Nobody was looking at menus anymore. Nobody seemed interested in checking the time. Even people waiting for takeaway orders remained happily where they were. Business had almost stopped. Yet somehow, it felt like the cafe had never been more alive. The final part of the melody approached. It slowed gently. The notes became softer, lighter, almost like saying goodbye. The last chord echoed through the room. Then everything became still. No one clapped immediately. The silence itself felt meaningful. Several long seconds passed. Then the older woman quietly stood. She placed one hand over her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice broke slightly. The young woman smiled gently. The applause began slowly. One pair of hands. Then another. Soon the entire cafe stood together. The sound of applause filled every corner of the room. People smiled at complete strangers. Several customers wiped away happy tears. The little girl clapped harder than anyone. The young woman looked completely overwhelmed. She stood from the piano and bowed her head politely. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," the manager replied. "The music already said it." Everyone smiled. The older woman walked forward. "My husband always believed the best musicians leave people feeling hopeful." She paused. "You've done exactly that today." The young woman thanked her quietly. Then the music teacher stepped closer. "I've taught piano for many years." The young woman listened respectfully. "I've heard students with perfect technique." The teacher smiled warmly. "But very few people know how to reach hearts." The young woman lowered her eyes modestly. "I'm still learning." "We all are." the teacher replied. Just then, the director from the arts organization introduced himself. I hope I'm not interrupting. The manager smiled. Not at all. The director turned toward the young woman. I happened to walk past this cafe today. She nodded politely. I'm very glad I did. He paused for a moment. Our organization hosts community music events throughout the year. The young woman listened carefully. We're always looking for musicians who can connect with people. He smiled. I believe you have that rare gift. The cafe became completely silent once again. The young woman looked surprised. I've never performed at an event like that. I know. But everyone begins somewhere. She looked uncertain. I don't know if I'm ready. The director smiled kindly. After what everyone here experienced today, he looked around the room filled with smiling faces. I think you're more ready than you realize. The customers quietly nodded. The manager smiled proudly. The little girl whispered to her mother, I hope she says yes. The young woman looked down at the old piano one more time. Just a few hours earlier, she had walked into the cafe hoping for a few quiet minutes with an instrument that most people had forgotten. Now that same piano had opened a door she had never expected. She took a slow breath. Without realizing it, the simple request she had made that afternoon had become the beginning of a completely new chapter in her life. The young woman stood quietly beside the old piano, still trying to understand everything that had happened. Only an hour earlier, she had walked into the cafe hoping for a few peaceful minutes with an instrument that had almost been forgotten. Now an entire room of strangers was smiling at her, and someone had just invited her to perform at a community music event. She took a slow breath. I truly don't know what to say, she admitted. The director smiled kindly. You don't have to decide this very second. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small business card. This has my contact information. He handed it to her. If you decide you'd like to perform, give me a call. There is no pressure. She accepted the card carefully. Thank you. I mean that, he replied. Not because you played perfectly, but because you made people feel something. That is much harder to teach. The music teacher nodded in agreement. I've been thinking the same thing. The manager smiled. I think everyone here agrees. The young woman looked around the cafe. So many people had stayed long after finishing their drinks. Some were still standing near the piano. Others had quietly returned to their tables, but no one seemed eager to leave. The atmosphere felt warm, almost like a family gathering. The little girl walked over with her mother. She held a small notebook in her hands. The young woman smiled. Hello again. The little girl looked a little shy. Would you write your name for me? The young woman looked surprised. My name? The little girl nodded. So I remember the first person who made me want to learn the piano. The young woman's eyes softened. She gently took the notebook and wrote her first name with neat handwriting. Underneath it, she added a short message. Keep learning. Music grows with patience. She handed the notebook back. The little girl read the message and smiled brightly. I'll remember that. Her mother thanked the young woman. You've inspired her more than you know. The young woman smiled. I hope she keeps that dream. I think she will, her mother replied. Nearby, the elderly gentleman slowly stood from his chair. He walked over using a wooden cane. I wanted to thank you personally. You don't have to. I do. He smiled warmly. My wife and I used to visit concerts every month. He looked at the piano. She passed away many years ago. The young woman listened quietly. Today, for a few minutes, your music reminded me of those evenings. He looked toward the window. That is a gift. She didn't know how to answer. Instead, she simply said, Thank you for telling me. The gentleman smiled. I hope you never stop playing. One by one, several customers came over. Some thanked her. Others shared small stories about memories her music had awakened. One woman said the melodies reminded her of her grandmother. A young man said he had almost given up on learning guitar, but now he wanted to start practicing again. Another customer admitted that it had been months since he had slowed down enough to simply sit and listen. The young woman realized something. None of them were talking about difficult piano techniques. None of them mentioned fast fingers or complicated music. They spoke about feelings, about memories, about hope. That meant more to her than any compliment. The manager returned carrying a small paper bag. "I have something for you." She looked confused. "What is it?" He smiled. "Just a little thank you." She opened the bag carefully. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread from the cafe bakery, a few homemade cookies, and a small package of tea. "You really didn't have to do this." "I know. But we wanted to." She thanked him sincerely. The manager looked at the old piano. "I've decided something." "What is that?" asked one of the waiters. "We're going to restore this piano." Everyone looked surprised. The manager continued. "It has been sitting here for years without anyone paying attention." He smiled. "Today reminded me why we bought it in the first place." The customers applauded. The waiters smiled at each other. "I'll help clean it," one said. "I'll polish it every week," said another. The little girl quickly raised her hand. "I'll come listen." The cafe filled with laughter. The manager looked at the young woman. "And if you're ever passing by again," he pointed toward the piano, "you'll never need to ask permission." She smiled with gratitude. "I'll remember that." As the afternoon slowly turned into evening, customers finally began leaving. Many waved goodbye. Several thanked her once more before stepping outside. The rain had stopped completely. The streets glowed softly under the evening light. The young woman also prepared to leave. She placed the small paper bag inside her canvas bag and carefully slipped the director's business card into her wallet. Just before she reached the door, the music teacher stopped her. "I have one more question." She turned. "Of course. What do you do for work?" The young woman smiled. "I work at the city library." The teacher looked surprised. "You organize books?" She nodded. "I've worked there for several years." The teacher laughed softly. "I suppose that explains why you enjoy learning." She smiled. "Books and music have always been my favorite teachers." The teacher nodded with respect. "I hope you'll continue learning both." "I will." The young woman stepped outside. Cool evening air greeted her. She looked back through the cafe window. The old piano was still standing in its corner. Only now it no longer looked forgotten. People were gathered around it, talking, smiling, and taking pictures. She smiled to herself before quietly walking home. The next morning she arrived at the library as usual. Nothing about her routine had changed. She returned books, helped visitors find novels, sorted shelves, recommended stories to children. Her coworkers noticed she seemed especially cheerful. "You look happy today," one of them said. She smiled. "I had a nice afternoon yesterday." During her lunch break, she quietly looked at the business card again. She still wasn't sure what to do. Performing in front of larger audiences felt frightening. She had always been comfortable playing quietly, without attention. Could she really stand on a stage? The question stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening across town. One of the teenagers from the cafe had recorded a short part of her performance on a phone. The recording wasn't planned. It lasted less than 2 minutes. That evening, the teenager uploaded it to social media with a simple caption. "I walked into a cafe and heard the most beautiful piano music. Nothing more. No dramatic title. No special effects. Just a genuine moment." By the next morning, thousands of people had watched it. Comments began appearing quickly. "Who is she? Where was this? Her music feels so peaceful. I've listened 5 times already. I wish I had been there." The teenager was surprised. "I didn't expect this." The video continued spreading. People shared it with friends and family. Local community groups posted it. Music lovers began searching for more information. But nobody knew very much. They only knew she had played an old piano in a neighborhood cafe. Back at the cafe, the manager noticed something unusual. New customers kept arriving. Many asked the same question. "Is this where the piano performance happened?" The manager smiled. "Yes." Some ordered coffee just to sit near the piano. Others asked if the young woman would return. "I hope so," the manager answered honestly. Even the local newspaper contacted the cafe. A reporter asked if someone could tell the story of what had happened. The manager simply said, "A kind young woman asked if she could play our old piano." The rest speaks for itself. The story spread because it felt real. There had been no advertising, no tickets, no famous performer, just a simple request made with kindness. Late that afternoon, the young woman finished work and walked home. She had no idea that thousands of people had already heard a small part of her music. As she reached her apartment building, her phone rang. It was the manager from the cafe. She answered, "Hello. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. I just thought you should know something." "What happened?" The manager laughed softly. "I think your visit has become bigger than any of us expected." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Someone shared a video from yesterday." She remained silent. "A lot of people have seen it." "How many?" The manager smiled. "I stopped counting." The young woman looked out the window in surprise. She never imagined that a quiet afternoon, an old piano, and one simple request could travel far beyond the walls of that little cafe. And as she held the phone in her hand, she realized that life was gently opening another unexpected door. One she had never planned to walk through, but one that might lead her to places she had only dreamed about. The young woman stood quietly by her apartment window after ending the phone call with the cafe manager. The city outside looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Cars moved through the streets, people hurried home from work, and children laughed as they played in a nearby park. But something had changed. Not outside, inside her. She placed her phone on the small table beside the window and smiled to herself. She had never imagined that asking to play an old piano for a few minutes would lead to so many unexpected moments. She remembered standing at the cafe entrance, wondering if the manager would even allow her to touch the piano. Now people she had never met were listening to her music. It all felt impossible. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. She made a simple breakfast and prepared for another day at the library. As she reached the front entrance, one of her coworkers smiled. "I saw a video last night." She looked surprised. "What video?" "The one with the piano in the cafe." The young woman laughed softly. "So you've seen it too?" Her coworker nodded. "I didn't know you could play like that." "I usually don't tell people." "Why not?" She thought for a moment. "I've always believed that music should speak for itself." Her coworker smiled. "I think it did." The rest of the morning passed peacefully. Several visitors came into the library looking for books. Children gathered in the reading corner while older visitors searched for history and travel books. Everything felt familiar. She enjoyed that. Fame had never been her goal. Helping people and playing music were enough. During her lunch break, she looked again at the business card from the arts director. She had been thinking about it all night. Finally, she picked up her phone. After taking one deep breath, she called the number. The director answered almost immediately. "I was hoping you'd call." She smiled. "I've made my decision. And I'd like to perform." The director sounded genuinely happy. "Wonderful. We have a community concert next month. It isn't a competition. It isn't about being perfect. It's simply a celebration of music." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I'd love to be part of it." Over the following weeks, life became a little busier. She continued working at the library during the day. In the evenings, she practiced whenever she could. Sometimes she visited the community center where she had first learned to play. The old volunteer who had encouraged her years before was still helping there. When he saw her walk through the door, he smiled warmly. "I heard you've been making people smile with your music." She laughed. "I think the story has traveled faster than I have." He smiled. "I always knew it would happen one day." She looked at him with gratitude. "If you hadn't let me stay after closing time all those years ago, I might never have kept playing." He gently shook his head. "I only unlocked the door. You were the one who walked through it." Those words stayed with her. A few days later, she returned to the cafe. This time, the atmosphere was different. The old piano had been carefully restored. Its wooden surface shined beautifully. Every key had been repaired and tuned. A small sign now stood beside it. It read, "Music has the power to bring strangers together. Everyone is welcome to share kindness through this piano." She smiled as she read it. The manager noticed her standing there. "You came back. I promised I would." He laughed. "And this time you don't need permission." Several customers recognized her. Instead of surrounding her, they simply smiled and waved. She appreciated that. The cafe still felt peaceful. The little girl from that first afternoon came running over with her mother. "I've started piano lessons." The young woman smiled brightly. "Really?" The little girl nodded proudly. "I practice every day. Sometimes I make mistakes." The young woman smiled. "That means you're learning." The child laughed. "I remembered what you wrote in my notebook. Music grows with patience." The young woman nodded. "Those words are still true." Her mother quietly thanked her. "You inspired more than just my daughter." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Our family spends more time together now. We listen to music every evening. It's become our favorite part of the day." The young woman felt deeply touched. She realized once again that small moments often create the biggest changes. Finally, the day of the community concert arrived. People of every age gathered in the local theater. Families filled the seats. Children laughed excitedly. Neighbors greeted one another. There were no famous performers backstage. Only local musicians who loved sharing music. The young woman waited quietly behind the curtain. She wasn't nervous because of the audience. She simply hoped she could make people feel the same peace they had felt in the cafe. The director walked over. "Ready?" She smiled. "I think so." He nodded. "Just be yourself." When her name was announced, warm applause welcomed her onto the stage. She walked slowly toward the grand piano waiting under the soft lights. For one brief moment, she remembered the forgotten piano in the cafe. She remembered brushing away the dust before playing her first note. She remembered asking one simple question. "May I play?" That memory made her smile. She sat down. The room became quiet. Then she began. The first melody filled the theater just as naturally as it had filled the cafe weeks earlier. Nothing about her playing had changed. She still wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply played with honesty. The audience listened closely. Some closed their eyes. Others smiled. Children watched her hands move across the keys with wonder. When the final note faded, the entire theater stood together. The applause continued for several minutes. She bowed her head with gratitude. After the concert, many people came to thank her. One elderly woman said the music reminded her of her childhood. A father explained that his young son wanted to learn piano after hearing her play. Several students asked how they could become better musicians. She gave everyone the same simple answer. Practice patiently. Be kind to yourself. And never stop learning. The local newspaper later published a story about the concert. Instead of focusing only on her performance, the article told the story of the old cafe piano. Readers loved the message. Many wrote letters saying they had started learning an instrument again after years of giving up. Some visited local community centers. Others donated old musical instruments to schools. A few cafes in nearby towns even placed pianos in their own dining areas, hoping to create moments where strangers could connect through music. Months passed. The young woman continued living a simple life. She still worked at the library. She still visited the cafe whenever she had time. She still practiced because she loved music, not because she wanted attention. The restored piano became a well-loved part of the cafe. People from different backgrounds sat down to play. Some were beginners. Some had years of experience. Everyone was welcomed with kindness. One afternoon, the manager noticed something that made him smile. A nervous teenager stood beside the piano. The teenager looked unsure. Finally, the teenager walked over and quietly asked, "Would it be all right if I played for a few minutes?" The manager smiled immediately. "Of course." As the teenager sat down, the young woman watched from a nearby table. She smiled quietly. The same opportunity that had once been given to her was now being passed to someone else. She realized that kindness has a way of growing. One person shares it, then another, then another. Years later, people still remembered the story of the ordinary afternoon when a young woman made one simple piano request. Many believed the unforgettable part was the beautiful music. But those who had been there knew the real reason. It wasn't only about the piano. It was about giving someone a chance before judging them. It was about listening before making assumptions. It was about discovering that extraordinary talent can appear in the most ordinary places. The old piano was no longer just a piece of furniture in the corner of a cafe. It had become a reminder that every person carries a story that others cannot see. Sometimes all it takes to uncover that story is a little kindness, a little patience, and the courage to say yes when someone quietly asks for a simple chance. And every time the young woman sat at a piano after that day, she remembered the first words she had spoken inside that cafe. Would it be all right if I played for just a few minutes? Those few minutes became the beginning of a journey that changed not only her life, but also the lives of countless people who learned that the greatest performances often begin with the simplest requests.